We are in the workroom of the Missouri Valley Special Collections, which is the local and regional history department of the Kansas City Public Library. We have been a department since 1960 with the mission to acquire, preserve, and make accessible documents and materials pertaining to the history of Kansas City and the surrounding region. Today we're going to talk about the Kansas City Stockyards collection. It's a collection we acquired back in 2008. I need to give a little background about the Kansas City Stockyards to begin with. It existed in Kansas City for 120 years. Really the beginning of the Stockyards had to do with the railroad, first of all. In 1869, the Hannibal Bridge opened, the first span across the Missouri River, and which was a real population and economic boom for Kansas City in 1869. And then we had the livestock industry. There was abundance of livestock in Texas. In Texas, there was markets in the east that were a high demand for beef, and so they were bringing those steer to Kansas and Missouri, putting them on rail yards and shipping them to the East Coast. With the Hannibal Bridge, Kansas City had railway access to Chicago and those eastern markets. So in 1871, some livestock dealers and railroad men decided to build pens and chutes and a facility to hold cattle there and to ship that cattle back east or to Chicago. A few years later, you started seeing meat packers and the meat packing industry move into Kansas City, and so the meat could be processed here in Kansas City rather than in Chicago. And so that was a real boon for the economy as well. And that was really the start of the Kansas City Stockyards in Kansas City in 1871. The livestock industry was very important to the growth of Kansas City. It was where it was located in the West Bottoms really was the central business district from the late 1890s through the early 20th century to the mid 20th century. It was the main employer between the stockyards, the meat packing industry, the retail operations that were down in the West Bottoms. That area employed as many as 20,000 people at any given time. There were communities down there of people that worked at these plants, worked at the stockyards, so there were schools, churches, retail operations down there. It really was the heart of Kansas City in the business community at that time, and really, with those jobs aided in Kansas City's population growth. Early on, you would have as many as, say in the 1860s, 1870s, you would have as many as 150, 160,000 head of cattle that would come through the stockyards. But by the early 1900s, you're looking at over 1 million head of cattle coming through the stockyards. In 1943, they had a record day of 64,000 head of cattle were received and yarded in the stockyards. And it wasn't just cattle. I mean, it was not only cows, but it was hogs and sheep as well. And it was but the stockyards was successful, but it also ran into a lot of obstacles, namely flooding. Where the obstacles are located at the confluence of the Kansas and Missouri rivers, it was very prone to flooding. So in 1903, 1908, 1911, they had major floods that they had to overcome. In 1917, there was a devastating fire that took out half of the stockyards, and you could imagine the stench in the stockyards at that time. And then in 1951, it was really Kansas City's Great Flood, and that's the one that really was the beginning of the end for the stockyards. But before then, from approximately after the flood of 1911 up until the flood of 1951, the stockyards was a very successful venture. The livestock industry, at the time, since the time that the stockyards closed, has really changed, and for that reason, that's why we no longer have the stockyards in Kansas City. Part of it was a flood of 1951 that had a lasting impact on that area, but really the cattle industry changed. There was really no reason to bring cattle to an urban center, and as Kansas City grew, it certainly was an urban center. You know, there were environmental concerns. There were of having cattle in the urban center. There were rising costs and shifting economics, and how it's changed most is people that raise cattle, farmers. Go to rural areas. They created these stockyards in more rural areas where the cattle are located, rather than have them in a centralized area in a major city. In 2008, the library was offered a collection of materials related to the Kansas City stockyards. They were held for many decades, gathering dust in the Livestock Exchange Building at 16th and Genesee. At the time, we really didn't know a lot about the collection, but it was offered to us. Come and get it, or we might have to throw it out. So sight unseen, we accepted a large donation of maps, land abstracts, photographs, postcards, and architectural drawings pertaining to the Kansas City stockyards. And really the focus of that collection is the built environment of the stockyards. These are architectural drawings of the pens, the layout, the space, how it was used. We say that we could take the materials that we have and recreate the stockyards if we wanted to, because there's that much detail in the collection. Then of course there's photographs and other interesting artifacts from the collection as well. But really the strength is the architectural drawings and maps in the built environment. And we have some of them here today to show you.
So one of my favorite things from the collection is that there are multiple maps documenting the stockyards area. The collection has a map of the stockyards area for just about every year between the 1890s and the 1930s. Which I think is really interesting because I love maps, and I think that they're a really interesting way of tracking the changes in an area throughout the years. So what I have on the table here is a map of the stockyards from 1899 and one from 1905. And even though there are a few years that passed between those years, you can compare the maps and see how much has already changed just in those few years. New railroad tracks have been built, new road traffic, streets have been built, new packing plants have been built. So it's just a really fascinating way to see how the stockyards area developed and grew and changed throughout the years, to be able to look at all of these maps throughout the years and see that change right there in front of you. So this document I have here is a locker room blueprint for the Standard Rendering Company. So after the animals went through the packing plants and they got the meat that they would, the parts that they would be able to turn into meat, the rest of it went to the rendering companies to turn into various products. So they had locker rooms there because it was pretty dirty work. So one thing that's really interesting about this is that the locker room actually shows segregated sections of the locker room. You can see here it says white, Mexican, and black. And they have separate entrances to go into separate sections of the locker room. This is really interesting as, you know, from an archival perspective, because we don't have very many documents that actually show that segregation there, that it's actually labeled as such. So this was something that when I found I thought was really interesting.
So everything you see on this table has to do with the construction of the American Royal Building in 1922. We have this in our collection because the Stockyards Company actually financed the construction of the 1922 building and built it on Stockyards property. So the American Royal and the Stockyards had a very symbiotic relationship. They were kind of codependent. Both needed a thriving livestock industry in Kansas City in order to survive. So the American Royal needed kind of the backing, the finance, the space, the staffing from the Stockyards Company. And the Stockyards Company did kind of the promotion that the American Royal provided, getting people into Kansas City, getting the eyes on Kansas City as kind of a focus of the livestock industry. So we have the architectural drawings for the 1922 building and a lot of the construction photographs as well. So the American Royal had been an annual tradition since 1899, and while this building is no longer in existence, the American Royal itself is still a thriving organization. So in many ways, it's kind of a legacy of the Stockyards. Another remnant of the Stockyards is the Livestock Exchange Building, which is still on Genesee Street down in the West Bottoms. And one of my favorite items in the Stockyards collection is this complete set of blueprints from the 1911 building. At the time, this was considered the largest livestock exchange building in the world. And also during the 1951 flood, the building filled with water all the way up to the second floor, so you can see the high water mark there to this day. So this is the facade of the building. I'm not an engineer, so I can't tell you a whole lot about these blueprints, but you can see their titles. This is the interior details of the main stairs. The thing to keep in mind with the Livestock Exchange Building is this was more of the administrative part of the Stockyards. So one of the things about the Stockyards Company that a lot of people in Kansas City will tell you is that there was kind of this pride in business being done with, quote, a handshake and a man's word. So the commission men and the people selling cattle and buying cattle, they would pretty much give a word of mouth agreement in the yards. Then transactions were actually made at the Livestock Exchange Building. So basically the documents we've shown you, they're a drop in the bucket of the whole collection. There's over 6,000 items, 6,000 maps, blueprints, documents, photographs that people interested in Kansas City Stockyards history can come and view here in person in the Missouri Valley Room.